You're watching our live and continuing coverage of what's being called now, quite universally, the booster budget. And what we're picking up from the budget papers that have just come out is the fact that there actually is a 2 lakh crore rupee increase in the government's capex spending. That's what the data currently seems to be suggesting, that the outlay for capital expenditure has been increased by 35.4% to 7.5 lakh crore rupees in FY23 from 5.54 lakh crore rupees in FY22, which is 2.9% of the GDP. Now, we will get more details on where specifically this public expenditure will happen, but what impact could this have, Udayan, on private investment and the fact that the government is spending so much more money on public expenditure in an attempt to really kickstart the economy and get it into one higher gear?
No, Rahul, I always thought that I was not in complete agreement with what was pointed out, that this was some kind of portrayal of higher capex when actually higher capex was not happening, because it was not squaring with some of the other issues which the government was talking about, which is that national highway construction will go up from 12,000 to 25,000 kilometers. The Ken-Betwa river linking project, which is 45,000 crores. So some major projects have been spoken about, and I think some of the capex outlay will go towards roads, towards water projects, towards higher allocation towards railways, and I think this will end up creating some kind of a multiplier effect. My problem is not with investments or the infrastructure part of the budget, which I think is probably the best part of the budget, that the capex boost has happened. The weaker aspects are to do with what we were talking about, is to provide relief to the weaker segments of the population. You know, as I was saying earlier, that you have capex and you have revex. Capex is growth oriented, which we have got. Revex is relief oriented. In that, I haven't seen an NREGA growth number in the budget yet. Maybe there is, but she did not read it out. So I don't know whether NREGA allocations have gone up very significantly. And as I said earlier, not significant amounts of work has been done on the MSME front. Now, these were the areas which could have dealt with some kind of, or done with some kind of income support, because that has been a big problem. So I don't think we have got the adequate level of income support in this budget. On middle class tax cuts and all, frankly, I think that really was not required this time around. As was pointed out, the middle class has done relatively better through the pandemic compared to the lower part of the pyramid. And I think if they have not got some small tweaks on income taxes, heavens will not fall. But the problem is on those welfare schemes like NREGA, on MSME, and I doubt whether enough has been done on that front.
Dr. Shamika Ravi, on the urban poor, there's talk about setting up a high-level committee, but no immediate allocation. Do you think, given the current circumstances of the economic distress caused on account of this pandemic, that is enough, or that's just like saying something without actually biting the bullet?
Well, frankly, in fact, a point that was raised a little while earlier was that there's nothing for farmers or agriculture in this budget. But I think you have to be a little more perspective. You think about this, that the areas where we saw the maximum agitation against the farm laws, like Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, these are regions in the country which have the smallest proportion of their population that is dependent on agriculture. So I think what you saw during that, in the guise of what was an agitation, is clearly something deeper. And I mean, there might be other issues, but I think jobs is one of them. And that is why I think this emphasis on large infrastructure investment, and of course she outlined a series of programs, whether it was the river linkage, so on and so forth. I mean, I think these are all that they do have a multiplier effect. It is very well documented globally as well as for Indian data that capex of a certain nature does have a multiplier effect. So I think that is what they are betting on, that the jobs will come through that. The second point, and I think that we're not emphasizing enough, is, India does aspire to attract a lot of, financing for climate change. In the sense, we want to be able to attract global investments that go towards this transition towards cleaner energy. However, we don't have the necessary instruments. We have very few. In fact, that market requires a lot of product design and a lot of innovation. And from that perspective, this was perhaps the first time in a budget where I heard the mention of climate finance, etc. So I think those are smaller things that are getting missed in the announcement.
You know, just to on Manrega, because this was raised by I think Udayan. The budgeted estimate this year is lower than the revised estimate of last year. So it's 73,000 crores versus 98,000 crores. And we've seen in the last few months, there has been a serious strain on or serious demand for greater rural jobs because clearly the pandemic has hurt a lot of people, has led to migration back from the cities to rural India. So we'll have to see how that squares up. Interestingly, all of this in the shadow of an election. Where again, to some extent, Shankar is right. Economic priorities you would have thought would be aligned with the political priorities because these are precisely the issues that the opposition is going to latch on to. You're already seeing that the opposition says there's very little for those who've been hurt the most by the pandemic. And I think the government will have to respond to that. What that response of the government will be to that criticism will be interesting to see. How are you actually cushioning the impact of the pandemic on those who've been hurt? They'll say, of course, we've already given through the Pradhan Mantri Krishi Yojana, we are giving monies directly in the hands of people. We're giving free rations in different parts of the country. Is that enough? Is the question that will be asked.
Plus the 35% increase in the government's expenditure on capital expenditure will obviously create a multiplier effect and will hopefully lead to job creation.
But that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to happen over a period of time.
Saurav Majumdar, has been the government's inability to spend. In years gone by, and particularly in the last year, first on account of the lockdowns and then on account of Omicron, the announcements which were made were not followed by actual expenditure, and therefore if the 35% increase in capex actually happens, that's significant, will have a multiplier effect, which is why this is being called the booster budget. But then the government also needs to walk the talk and spend the money that they're promising to spend for that multiplier to kick in.
Absolutely, Rahul. I think that's something we've been discussing, the government's inability to spend, which is why the large, cash balances with the RBI. So therefore, we have announced, she's announced a very substantial increase in spending for the next year. But as again, much like disinvestment and privatization, the proof of the pudding will be in the execution. And that's one thing. But I must say this of this budget, I think this is in line with the government's overall stance of not directly, sending money in the hands of people in that sense, but creating an ecosystem for the future. And she has mentioned this multiple times that this is, in India, this budget is for India at 100, not just India at 75 and beyond. So I think this is also setting the stage. And remember one more thing, when we talk about this whole strategy of barbell with agile, this whole strategy also means that, whenever required, they will respond to high frequency indicators which are showing up problem areas and then do the needful. So let's not focus too much on this particular budget as having not done this or that, and let's hope that the expenditure actually happens in productive areas, and if there are course corrections required, the government will come forward with the RBI and also step in. So that's the hope, I think, which this budget provides.
Just responding to the point that Rajdeep was raising, Rahul, the government is clearly probably demonstrating with its actions, not in as many words, that they believe that handouts don't win elections. In the longer term, you have to convince people that there are enough jobs and employment opportunities being created for the youth. You cannot have a situation where 1 in 3 people who are in the job market can actually avail of a job and 2 in 3 cannot. No, that is the biggest deterrent today against any belief in any political party or the government from a section of the population. So I think the emphasis is on trying to create some kind of employment generation machines. It's not that only capex has gone up. Look at what else they're doing. They said that the 15% concessional rate of tax, where the sunset was March 23, is now being extended to March 24. Now, if this new manufacturing capacities come up, they will employ more people. So you can see the the kind of thought process which has gone behind this budget. Sure, it has given short shrift to people whose incomes have been affected, and that's not a good thing. Maybe more should have been done. But the handiwork is quite clear. The blueprint is quite clear that they're clearly prioritizing infrastructure, investments, and jobs over any kind of handouts or income support. That's the chosen mode of the government. In that, I think there's one thing which I should point out, that the government's methods of raising capital for next year seem quite tepid, because they have a very weak divestment target of 65,000 crores. They have not mentioned the word asset monetization program at all in this budget, where the hope was that they would lay out a blueprint or a roadmap for raising 1 to 1.5 lakh crores through asset monetization. That did not find any mention in the budget. So where is the extra capital going to come for to keep the deficit at 6.4% and to keep spending for the kind of growth that we are talking about? That, I think, is probably one of the weaker aspects of this budget.
Let me give you the political analysis to that. I think the difference between the Modi government, Udayan, and the previous governments was that Mr. Modi is much more confident of his political power. Because it's a majority government, he genuinely seems to believe that he's here for the long term. So I don't need to fix the economy for the next 6 weeks because there's an election in Uttar Pradesh. I don't need to give a handout. But remember, in 2019, ahead of the general elections, that's when the government had gone ahead, the Pradhan Mantri Krishi Samman Yojana, giving 2,000 rupees a quarter. That had been done then. That was the one occasion when it appeared that the government recognized the need that you needed to put some money in people's pockets. But by and large, the Modi approach has been, we will not give doles and handouts to win elections. We are here for the long term. The question is, in the long term, are we all dead? And because of the pandemic, the short-term effect that it's had on people's lives, how are you going to cushion that? How do you provide immediate relief? I think that's the concern that critics of the government will have.
Yeah. Let me respond to that, Rajdeep, for a minute, and you can toss it to Shamika and Mr. Garg as well. The government is, from this budget, it appears to me, it's the government's way of saying that we did what we could over the last couple of years when the pandemic was raging, in terms of liquidity support, in terms of the stimulus package, whatever the fisc could allow. And now that we believe that the pandemic is slowly exiting, we need to now move away from revenue expenditure to capital expenditure, because the phase for relief, focusing on relief and revenue expenditure, all the schemes and the handouts and the income support schemes and the liquidity schemes, now we need to transition away from that and get to capital expenditure, because that is what drives multipliers and that is what drives growth. Sure. And I think this is the budget, it's a budget of transition from RevEx to CapEx, if you will, and that's clearly the government's intent.
But people are still hurting. Mr. Garg, you want to respond to that? 84%, that figure strikes out. 84% of households have lost income in the last 2 years. Given that, can we move as easily as Udayan is saying from a RevEx to a CapEx budget?
So the government's approach to reach to this 84% has been, barring the PM Krishi Samman Yojana, is to reach through providing the life improving kind of facilities, whether it is toilets or houses or electricity connection and things like that, and more recently the water. So that has been continued in this budget. So there has been increased allocation for water program and all. So that is, but the government has eschewed the direct cash transfers, has not gone for handouts in that sense. So that is in a way conveying the continuity of the approach. But RevEx to CapEx would require that the revenue estimates are correctly placed. I see from the food subsidy and the fertilizer subsidy and the Narega program allocations for the next year, I see there is an underestimation in my judgment.
That's right. Fertilizer subsidy 1.05 lakh crore versus 1.40 lakh crore. This is, of course, budgeted estimate versus revised estimate. Food subsidy 2.06 lakh crore versus 2.86 lakh crore. Petroleum subsidy 5,813 crores versus 6,517 crores. But
what you are reading is the revised estimates
Sure.
for the current year.
that's right, versus the
If
budgeted
you look at
estimates
the
of last year.
budget estimates for the next year, the food subsidy is, I think, somewhere close to 2,05,000 crore, which is less than even this year's budget estimate subsidy.
Yes.
There is no way the government can reduce the subsidies to that level for the next year. Likewise, fertilizer subsidies have been reduced. NREGS is back to 73,000 crores kind of thing. So in my assessment, and this remains preliminary, that the revenue expenditure for the next year has been perhaps estimated far more conservatively than what it is. There is definitely an increase, and I see this number now on the capex side. That state government 1 lakh crore loan is loan, so that 7.5 becomes 6.5, and of this 6.5, there is an increase in the allocation for railways. There is an increase in the allocation for highways. Now that highways allocation has been substantially enhanced, does it indicate that the highways program would be speeded up or enhanced, or it will substitute the NHAI's own borrowing from the market,
Right.
which it is finding difficult to do, and the government provides more of the support to them? That we will have to see. But there is, of the 1 lakh crore which I was earlier saying about the green bonds probably substituting, at least part of that is increased capex. For the current year, what you see from the budget to the revised estimates, the 60,000 odd crore of increase in the capex is only on account of the Air India losses being substituted by the government of India's loan to the Air India asset management company. So that is also not a real increase in the capex in the RE.
Okay.
Okay, Deep Kalra joins us from Make My Trip. One of the sectors that's been most badly hit on account of the pandemic has been the travel hospitality sector. We're now hopefully emerging out of this pandemic as Omicron numbers come down. Deep, your initial sense of the government spoke about the need to boost services, but your sense of the extent to which the budget does enable a bounce back in the services sector, particularly travel and hospitality?
Yeah, well, if we just focus on our sector of travel and hospitality, there is some relief which has been provided to a much needed sector, clearly a sector which has been ravaged by the pandemic. So I would say the emergency credit line guarantee scheme, the extension of that is welcome. The fact that 50,000 crores is going to be earmarked for tourism and hospitality is welcome. However, we want to see the fine print here. There is some disconnect in terms of what will be the actual increase for the sector. So definitely still trying to get to the fine print out here. Is this an actual increase? The headline is great. It is good news. It is much needed. But let's be very clear. This is very good for the large corporates, the mid-sized corporates who can actually avail of this credit. It's been 2 years of the pandemic, and our sector, as everyone knows, is a very fragmented sector. There are a lot of small players in this sector. I don't think they will have any ability to survive this pandemic if they're not given relief to repay. So I think we would love to see that, because they're the ones who've been hit the worst. The others have obviously got the balance sheet to survive. That's one. The second positive I see is definitely the e-passport scheme. A small thing, but it'll go a long way. Eventually, when people can travel overseas, I think it'll be helpful to have e-passports embedded with smart chips. Will make the whole process more convenient, easy. The world over, now developed countries are using that. So something which should have been done. I don't think it's a huge thing, but we have to look for whatever we can get right now. In the same vein, I think we should have looked at visas. We should have definitely looked at visas as Omicron recedes, like you said, and people are willing to come to India. Why wouldn't we have a free visa scheme for a period of time, not blocking our passports from people for too long, just allowing people to come more easily, whoever wants to come. It just gives the right signal when you want to get people coming in, because again, let's not forget, within travel and tourism, who's hit the worst are the inbound players. So players who focus entirely on foreign travelers coming to India, They've seen nothing for 2 years, and therefore, consequently, neither have the hotels. Aviation sector has not been mentioned. So unless there's something which was not mentioned, I heard the entire speech, nothing on aviation, which is much needed again, very badly hit, very high fixed costs. So we were definitely expecting some relief out there. Have not got that. Tax rationalization was expected. There is a TCS disconnect out here between foreign players and Indian players. Indian players actually getting disadvantaged if you buy a holiday from them. So hopefully it's been addressed in the fine print again, like I say, but not overtly. And one of the big demands from the industry was why not extend the LTA to cover this scheme? You know, the Prime Minister has said he would like Indians to go and see 15 new destinations over 3 years. Yes, we've lost 2 years in the pandemic, but going forward, if you want to do that, then maybe a tax benefit on the personal taxation side would have given the necessary impetus that is required for people to go and travel more. So the sector overall is actually disappointing.
Okay, we'll slip into a quick break right now. When we come back, what we're doing really right now is updating the budget intelligence dashboard, and what we'll be able to do soon is go sector by sector, because typically you hear from the Finance Minister the allocations for every sector. She condensed the speech from about 2 hours, 40 minutes in years gone by to 1.5 hours, as a result of which a lot of the allocations were missed out, and which is what people are looking out for. How much is the government actually going to spend on different sectors, and how does this compare with spending in the past? So we look at that.
Because there's an interesting figure in FY22, GOI's capex in the first 8 months is 50% of what was budgeted for the same year. How do you ensure 7.5 lakh crores now for 22-23?
Sure, but
obviously we are in different times.
Correct.
So therefore there
part
is
of that was the lockdown,
sure, so
the waves,
the possibilities are greater.
Migrants going back home.
But we will need to see announcements being backed this time by outcomes on the ground. So those numbers will be interesting. Fascinating in that sense to look at those numbers and do a deep dive that Rahul and his team will do. Let's take a break. You're having lunch. No tax relief for the middle class, but that's...
We're not having lunch. Only Rajdeep's having lunch, and he's going just now.
That's right. I'm going to go and have some lunch. Rahul and Uday will take it forward. You're watching the Booster Shot Budget here on India Today.